Setting your suspension sag is often overlooked and can make a huge difference to your riding. But if you've never done this, don't worry, because I'm going to show you exactly how to do it for both your front and, if you have it, rear suspension. Perhaps you think you know already. Well, here we have two great mountain bikes, but one is set with too much sag and the other doesn't have nearly enough. But before I run you through it step by step, I'm going to ride them both back to back to see just how much difference it will make to my riding. Spoiler alert, it's not going to feel good. By the end of this video, we'll be making sure both these bikes are set up perfectly and ready to hit the trails. But first, a big thanks to Madison for sponsoring this video and giving me some fresh kit to wear. If you want to know more, hit the link in the description. Oh, and stay tuned until the end of the video for a nugget of suspension setup advice you won't want to miss. Here's my lovely Cannondale Habit. It's set up with 50% sag front and rear, which is way too much. This bike is really soft. Let's see how it rides. Okay, so just dropping in, and it feels crazy soft, like the front end of the bike is diving all over the place. The geometry feels all off because suddenly the geometry will change as I hit a bump. Which is really weird. I can feel it bottoming out underneath me, which is horrible. So I seem to like have good traction because it's soft, but then as soon as it bottoms out, I've got no traction again. And yeah, just sort of not really able to control the bike the way I want to because it's so soft, and I keep getting deflected off things that I wouldn't usually. Oh, it's bottoming out going up the face of the jump. That's horrible. It's sitting really low in the travel, so like I can feel how close my feet are to the floor because the bottom bracket's too low. It's really horrible to jump because there's no support in the suspension. It's just wallowing and wobbling around all over the place. Oh, case that. It's like ruined the handling of the whole bike. Well, that certainly didn't feel much fun. Let's have a look at my downhill bike. It's set up with 10% sag, which is much too firm. I'm interested to see how it rides. Oh, it's so hard, it's so firm. I got no grip, I'm getting shaken around like something else. The wheels aren't really contacting the ground very much, and as soon as they do touch the ground, they bounce up again. My arms are hurting, I've got no grip. The BB feels crazy high, which is horrible. I'm offline. Yeah, this is absolutely almost unrideable. Carries loads of speed over the jumps, but it just feels bucky and not very nice. Not my favourite, that's for sure. Why is sag important? Well, it allows the suspension to give you the correct mix of grip and support that you need. Grip comes from the wheel staying in contact with the uneven ground beneath the bike. Support from the suspension allows the bike to handle well, responding to the rider's inputs. For the suspension to perform both of these functions properly, the bike will have to sit in the correct portion of the suspension's travel, when it's compressed by the rider's weight and the force of gravity. We call this the sag. Setting your sag means correctly identifying and setting the stiffness of the spring, often referred to as the spring rate. Now that you know what sag is and what it's like to ride with an incorrect setup, as I promised, I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step guide of how to set your sag, starting with the forks. Let's go! The majority of forks today are air sprung, and they have a Schrader valve on top of the fork leg to fill the fork with air. To do this, you need a shock pump with a gauge and a ruler. That's it, no fancy toolkit, just these two things. Your fork will have a rubber O-ring on the spring leg. Make sure it's pressed down all the way against the seal. Next, get onto the bike wearing your normal riding gear and assume the attack position. That means form your body into the shape it would usually be when you're riding down the trail, ready to tackle a feature. I'd recommend standing on the pedals with your arms and legs slightly bent, leaning on the handlebars. Don't bounce on the bike, just stand there. When you're ready, gently step off the bike without moving the suspension. If you have a RockShox fork, you can look at the anodized markings on the leg to see how much sag you're running. With a front fork, you're aiming at between 20 and 25%. If you don't have a RockShox fork, it's maths time. Other manufacturers' forks don't have these markings, so it's time to do some maths. You need to calculate how much sag you've got. First, use a trusty ruler to measure the amount of stanchion showing above the seal but below your sag ring. Take the measurement in millimeters and divide it by the amount of travel the fork has, not the amount of stanchion which shows above the seal, and then multiply by 100. For this fork it's 50 mil, so we divide 50 mil by 200 and then times by 100, which gives us the percentage. However, if the measurement you get is below 20%, then let out a little air using your shock pump, noting the new pressure. If it's above 25%, then add a little air with a few pumps on your trusty shock pump, and again, note the new pressure. Air forks have a negative spring, which improves the feel of the suspension. Most modern air-sprung forks have a transfer port to allow air to automatically equalise between the positive and negative chambers in the air spring. So make sure you cycle the fork slowly a few times after changing the air pressure. This allows the air to circulate through the transfer port and avoids false sag readings. If you have a coil fork, refer to the manufacturer's specification to check you have the right stiffness of spring installed. If you do, simply wind the preload dial on top of the fork leg plus or minus until you achieve the correct sag. Spring preload dials compress the spring by pushing on it, even before the suspension is compressed by the rider's weight. However, it doesn't alter the stiffness of the spring. If you've tried to achieve the correct sag measurement by using your preload dial, but simply can't get it into the 20 to 25% sweet spot, then you have to replace your spring with one which matches your weight. If you don't know which spring you need, or you're not confident in taking your forks apart, head to your local bike shop or suspension specialist for advice. Now, let's look at the rear. If you have a full suspension mountain bike, you should be setting the sag on your rear shock too. You should generally aim for between 25 and 30% sag on the rear. Opinions differ depending on what the bike is used for, the suspension design and other factors, but this is a good ballpark figure to begin working from. Coil shocks can offer less stiction than air shocks and are more resistant to heat build-up, but they are more difficult to tune and are usually heavier. To set the sag on your shock, you'll need all the same equipment as you needed for doing the fork, so I'll get right into it. Push the rubber sag ring down the shaft until it's down against the seal. Make sure your shock is in the open or unlocked position if you have a pedal platform or a lockout. Next, get onto your bike wearing your normal riding gear and sit on the seat gently. If you have a dropper post, make sure it's in the lowest descending position. Gently lift your feet up off the floor. Put your feet back on the floor and gently get off the bike without compressing the suspension. If you have a RockShox shock, you will be able to use the sag indicators anodized into the shaft to measure the sag. Other manufacturers' shocks do not have these markings, so use your trusty ruler and measure the amount of shaft showing above the seal. To find the percentage sag, take the measurement and divide it by the shock stroke, not the amount of travel that the bike has, and multiply by 100. If the sag is too low, then the shock is too hard, so let a few PSI out of the shock. Conversely, if the sag percentage is too high, then your shock is too soft, so add a few PSI. Just like air forks, air shocks have a negative spring, and like air forks, make sure you cycle the suspension slowly a few times after changing the air pressure. This allows the air to circulate through the transfer port between the positive and negative chambers to ensure you get an accurate reading. Suspension linkages on different full suspension bikes vary the shock's actuation ratio as it progresses through the rear suspension's travel. So I know this isn't an exact measurement, but as a general rule, it works well enough. If you have a coil shock, there's a preload collar which tightens down on the spring to increase the preload, reducing the sag. Spring preload collars compress the spring even before the suspension is compressed by the rider. Preloading a spring doesn't affect its stiffness though, and the collar should always be tight enough so that the spring cannot be pushed off the collar with your fingers, but should only be tightened as far as the manufacturer recommends. Too loose and the spring will rattle around, damaging the shock. Too tight and the spring can become coil bound, which means the metal coils of the spring crash into each other before the shock has chance to go through its full stroke. This can damage the spring, the shock and the bike. Bad times. If you can't achieve the correct sag measurement by using your preload collar, you will need to purchase a different spring. If you don't know which spring you need, or you're not confident on fitting it yourself, why don't you visit a suspension specialist who will be happy to help you. Use the bump stop on the shock to mark the sag on the shock shaft. To do this, push the bump stop right up to the seal against the shock body as far up as it can go. Sometimes it's necessary to use a tyre lever to get it up there. Gently sit on the bike, no need to stand up this time, and remove your feet from the ground. Don't bounce and make sure you move gently. Measure the amount of shaft that is visible between the shock body and the bump stop. If you need to run more sag, turn the preload collar anti-clockwise. If you're running too much sag, turn the preload collar clockwise. If you can't achieve the desired amount of sag with the preload collar, unfortunately it's time to get a different coil spring. Usually they come in 50 to 25 pound increments. This is trial and error and it can be an expensive process, but thankfully there are plenty of great suspension tuners out there to help you, and there are some really good spring calculators online. Okay, this is much better. So I'm getting support from the suspension, the dynamic geometry feels the way it should feel, and I'm able to pick my line properly because the bike is giving me the support I need in order to ride it properly. Even over the routes where it's actually firmer suspension, I'm getting better grip because I'm not bottoming out. And here come the jumps, which will become a pleasure instead of a chore, I'm sure. Oh yeah, here we are, so proper support. Carrying speed, I'm able to jump further with less effort. The job's a good one. It works. Okay, so instantly this feels better. The bike is generating grip when I need it to. It's sitting at the right point in the sag, so the geometry feels way better than it did before. I can feel myself like comfortable on the bike, so like I'm going for lines. If I'm like, oh, I'll go over there, like it's doing what I want it to do. Obviously that is exactly what you want from your bike. You want it to sit in the travel and provide you with the right geometry and the platform to push off. So jumping's effortlessly easy and carrying good speed, but it just feels way more effortless. I'm moving the bike from one side of the trail to the other just whenever I want to. So much better. It's amazing the difference that a few PSI make. There you have it, everything you need to know to set your sag. With the correct sag set, your bike should perform properly out on the trails, soaking up the bumps and providing a consistent platform, allowing you to enjoy the ride. However, sometimes you can find that despite the correct sag setting, your suspension still isn't performing optimally. There are many adjustments you can make to set it up perfectly, but they're all topics for future MB UK videos. So just a quick tip to leave you with then. If you increase the stiffness of your spring, you will need to add more rebound damping to match using your rebound adjusters. You need to do this in order to keep the suspension recovering at the same rate it was before, as whatever spring force is keeping the bike at the sag point is managed by the rebound damper. Harder spring equals more rebound damping needed, softer spring equals less rebound damping needed. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And if this is your kind of content, then you'll probably want to watch this video next. And then times 100. And the answer is 25%. I think that's right, isn't it? Fuck, I'm shit at maths. Okay.